What's up guys, and welcome to this tutorial on covering the ways to make selections in Photoshop using the marquee, the lasso, and I will be touching on the magnetic and magic wand tools as well. Now there are other ways to make selections, the most common of which being the pen tool, but the pen tool is more complex and has other features as well. So I'll be covering that in a different video, but I will link that video to this in case that's what you're after. Doing this tutorial, I am assuming that people have some basic knowledge of Photoshop, but I will be mentioning any keyboard shortcuts that are possible as and when I use them or will be naturally coming across them. So to start with, I'm going to open a new document. Now this can be done obviously with File New, but you can simply press Ctrl N for a new document. To start with, I'll start with the rectangular marquee tool. This is available on the left or by simply pressing the M key. Now the rectangular marquee tool is exactly what it says. So what you do is you left click at a point and drag to select a rectangle. You'll notice you get a sort of flashing line, marching ants or whatever you want to call them to indicate where you have selected. When you have finished your selection, you simply let go of the mouse button and that is your rectangle selected. If you then want to deselect a selection you've just made, there's multiple ways to do it. The quickest and easiest is simply to press Ctrl and D on your keyboard. The next tool to discuss will be the elliptical marquee tool. Now you can select this tool by right clicking on your rectangular marquee and selecting elliptical marquee. But you'll notice that there is a shortcut for M for that tool. Now obviously if you simply press M under normal circumstances, it will simply select what's there. But you can press Shift and M or Shift and any shortcut and it will alternate between the options. So I have rectangular marquee tool selected. If I press Shift M, I will get the elliptical marquee. Now the elliptical marquee tool works in the same way as the rectangular marquee, with the exception that it creates ellipses rather than rectangles. So again, you click left mouse button, hold it down, drag out and let go, and you will have selected an ellipse. Now you can select ellipse of any size or any shape. Again, deselect that. The next selection tool is out of the marquee and is into the lasso tools. Now the primary one is just the normal lasso tool. This is a free selection tool with sort of zero constraints, so you can select wherever you move the mouse. Now this means it's very hard to be precise with this selection, but it does add some sort of randomness to your selections if that's what you need. So for this again, you left click, hold and simply drag wherever you want. And it will select that shape. Just over and over, you can select whatever shape you want, no matter how wavy. But as you can see, try to select sort of a straight line is problematic. This is where the next tool comes in, which is the polygonal lasso tool. Again, this can be selected by right clicking on your tool or simply hitting Shift L to select the next tool down. Now the polygonal lasso tool is like the lasso tool we just went through, except it has the constraint that it will always select straight lines between 2 points. So to use it, you left click to start your selection. You move the mouse and as you can see, it just draws a straight line to wherever I move the mouse. If I click again, it will create a corner and I can move the mouse then in any direction, but again in a straight line. And you can click as many times as you like in doing this selection. Now to finish this selection off, you can either hover over the start point, at which point you will get a little circle to the bottom right hand side of your cursor to indicate that it will be completing the selection. Alternatively, when you get to your last point that you want, you can simply double click Now this selection tool is great for sort of rough selections if you're copying part of an image into another one, at which point you can then more accurately cut it out or use other features such as layer masks, or if you're just simply creating geometric shapes. But it is very difficult with the polygonal lasso tool to get smooth curves, because you'll notice that there'll be a straight line, an angle, a straight line. You'll end up with a straight line, an angle, a straight line, an angle, and so on, instead of a smooth curve. The next tool I want to talk about is the magnetic lasso tool or the magic wand. Now both do vaguely similar jobs in that they select an area of colour or distinguish between areas of contrast. Now you'll see in the background I've just created some random shape. So if we select the magnetic lasso tool, which is in the normal lasso, what you can do is, if I zoom into this point, if I start at a corner and click and I'll drag away, if you notice there's a curve line going towards my cursor. As I drag, it will automatically default along the edge of the black shape, because this is the sort of border between the high contrast white and the high contrast black. Now I can manually create points as I go. Now you'll see this tool isn't actually perfect, and I've actually just gone off and it's cut into the black, but it does do a reasonable job. But you can go completely off and it has no idea where you're going if you go straight through a solid colour. But once you get to the edge, it will lock back on. Now if you're actually selecting a shape that is so obviously a different colour and a completely different contrast to the background, what you can use is the magic wand. And now the magic wand will select an area that is the same colour. So if I simply click the magic wand on the black area, it will select the whole black area. Each selection tool has modifiers using the Shift or Alt key depending on the tool and when you use the modifier. So I've covered the basics of how you use the selection tools, but what I will be going through now is using the selection tools with modifiers. So going back to the rectangular marquee tool, again you make a selection as normal. So if you left click, drag and hold, if I now hold the Shift key, as you can see, it instantly jumps to being a perfect square. If I let go of the Alt key, if I let go of the Shift key, it goes back to being a rectangle. And then if I press and hold the Alt key, what's going on is I'm now dragging a rectangle, and it will always be based away from the centre of the rectangle. No matter how far I move the mouse, it will always just be from the centre. Now you can actually combine these, so if I hold Shift again and get a perfect square, if I then hold Alt, I will drag a perfect square away from the centre. Now the elliptical marquee tool works in a similar way, but obviously it creates ellipses, so by holding Shift it will create a perfect circle. Alt works exactly the same though, that it will always be dragging away from the centre of that circle. So where I initially clicked will remain the centre of the circle. Again, you can combine them, holding Shift and Alt will draw a perfect circle away from the centre. Moving on to the lasso tool, there are no modifiers on the standard lasso tool. So Shift and Alt don't actually do anything in terms of constraining it. Now Alt does not do anything for the polygonal lasso tool, but what becomes useful with the polygonal lasso tool is if I click to start a selection and I hold Shift, you can see that as I hold Shift it defaults to a line directly down. Now holding Shift as I make a selection will lock my selection to either straight horizontal, straight vertical or the 45-degree angles. So it is great for selecting very geometric shapes. The second use of Alt and Shift modifiers is after you have made a selection. So going back, it doesn't matter what selection you make at this point, so I'll just make a rectangle. But now, as I have made that selection, I can also use the Shift and Alt modifiers to alter and change this selection. You'll notice that now on my cursor, if I hold the Shift key, or you'll notice on your cursor that if you hold the Shift key, you get a little plus turn up in the bottom right hand side of your cursor. If you press and hold Alt, you get a small minus sign. Now what this is doing is affecting your selections up here in the top left of your screen, and it changes to add to selection or subtract from selection. That's what the plus and minus symbols are for. So if I hold Shift down and get the plus symbol to add to my selection, it will allow me to draw a second rectangle, and if I let go, that's now added to the shape. There is no reason though that this additional selection has to be in any way attached to your original. I can make as many selections as I want using this tool. Now the subtract selection works in exactly the same manner, just obviously the opposite. So I hold the Shift key, the Alt key, for which I get subtract from selection, and again making a selection, at which point when I let go, that has been removed from my selection. Now there is no reason this has to be in the edge. I can make a selection in the middle, and it will simply cut that out. So if I now fill that selection, as you can see, I have a hole effectively in the middle of that selection. When you are making selections or adding or subtracting from a selection, you can combine the tools to do that. So I can make a selection with a rectangular marquee tool. I can then select the normal standard lasso tool, hold down Shift, and I can drag any shape that I wish to add, and I can subtract any shape that I also wish to subtract. And this applies to all the tools. I could use the magic wand tool and select and hold Shift and make another selection, and so on and so forth. So being able to add or subtract from a selection is quite powerful. Now there are further methods for altering your selection. So if I again make another selection, these are available by right clicking in your selection, and you'll see a menu pop up. Now some of these I believe are self-explanatory, but I will cover them anyway. Select inverse. At the moment, this selection that I've made is the circle, and will only be the circle, but select inverse means it will select everything else except that circle. So as you can see now, I've got the dotted line marching ants around the edge of my worksheet and around the circle, which means I've selected everything but the inside of that circle. The next tool down on this list is Feather. Now Feather is an extremely powerful tool. What that does is it blurs the edge of my selection. So if I can simply fill this selection, as you can see, you get a very hard edge on that selection. But if I right click and feather, now for sort of this demonstration, and I'll pick a large-ish number, say 20. If I now fill this circle again, as you can see, I get it feathers the colour out, and you get a sort of gradient at the edge, so you end up with a blurry edge. This is great for if you want to blend objects together. Just be wary that obviously it will always create a very soft edge. Now if you're making a selection to cut one image out to place in another, you can quickly end up with very sharp and jagged edges. So for that purpose, I generally use a feather of around 0.5 to 0.8 pixels. The next tool that's very useful in selections is being able to transform a selection. If I have this rectangle selected in the middle of my screen, if I simply choose to transform the shape of this, and now this can be done in by the menu or simply pressing the keyboard shortcut of Control T, I can then change the shape of this. However, any shape that I change will actually, as you notice, will actually change the corresponding pixels below. So it is affecting the white layer that I have in the background. So I can make it smaller, I can move it around, but it will always affect the actual coloured pixels in the background. But say I wanted to change the shape without actually affecting the pixels, what you can do is in the select menu at the top of your screen, there is an option for transform selection. Now picking this, you get the same transform controls and the same handles in the corners and edges, but if I change this selection it does nothing, it only transforms the actual selection. Now you can drag these points around, you can rotate your selection. Now why this is particularly powerful is that if you click on a corner, you'll notice that it moves sort of the two edges, and I can make it any shape that I want. Now again, I can, similar to when you make the selection, you can use the shift modifier which constrains the shape, so it will always be in proportion to its original, just larger or smaller. This is very important if you're taking a part of a photograph and resizing it to fit in your piece of work. So whether it's a person, a car, a house, a building, boat, whatever, obviously you want to maintain the proportions, else it would look odd in your work. You can also use, in this sense, for the transform selection, and this applies to also just the normal transform tool, you can also use control as a modifier. What that allows you to do is move a point independent effectively of the others. So if I hold the control key down, I can click this middle point and I'll be able to move it left and right. It will also allow me to move it up and down. But obviously, as you can see, it allows me to select, make my rectangle into a parallelogram. But say that's not the shape I actually wanted, if I hold control key down on a corner, I can then move this point independent of the others. And again, I can then pick another corner, and I can make this effectively whatever four-sided shape that I want to use. But this concludes the end of my tutorial on the basics of selections within Photoshop. As I said at the beginning, there are other methods to making selections, but these are more complex methods. The pen tool is the most common, but it is more complex and has many other features that are available to that tool. So I will be covering that in another tutorial. But I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and if you've got any questions, just leave them in the comments below.